Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. My name is Stephen Cobb, and I'm joined with my law partner and Republican extraordinaire, the former Congressman from Northern Virginia, Tom Davis. Tom, welcome. It's great to be here with you and talk a little bit about Virginia politics, the election, and what that means for folks going forward.
Thanks, Steve. I think people should know you were active in the Democratic administrations and the Attorney General's office in the state, have been an active Democrat. Of course, I was a Republican congressman for 14 years, and my wife was in the legislature for 10 years and in the governor's cabinet. So we hit both sides of the political spectrum, try to keep this as balanced as we can in terms of the analysis as we move forward. Steve, let me just start with a couple top lines on the Virginia election, just to put it in perspective. First is the history. In 10 of the previous 11 elections for governor since Virginia became a two-party state, the president's party has lost the governorship. So historically, Virginia has been what we call a counter-cyclical state, and they kind of use this to send a message to Washington. The exception to that was Terry McAuliffe's own win in 2013, but there he faced a divided Republican Party, had a huge spending advantage, and a Republican-led government shutdown a month before the election, which put him over narrowly. So these trends have been historic in Virginia, and even as the state has gotten bluer, the question going into this was, had it turned so Democratic that this trend wouldn't continue? And I think for a couple of other factors I'm going to discuss, the demography of the state wasn't enough to overcome these mid-year trends. Secondly is just to talk about the president, Joe Biden. We saw in the polling that the Democrats' numbers went down right after Afghanistan. They started to fall. Confidence in the president and his favorability went down. And Glenn Youngkin, who started this race closer than most Republicans do, started to bump up again. This became a very, very competitive race. And in the closing few weeks with the school controversy taking over, it put Youngkin to victory. And the third factor is the governor-elect was an extraordinary candidate. Not only didn't he have a public record that they could attack, but he had a lot of money, put $20 million of his own money into this race. So in the previous decade, basically, we've seen Democrats with huge spending advantages. That didn't happen down the stretch. The irony of this election is the Democrats, as they came into power, had loosened Virginia's election laws, taken away a photo ID. They had expanded voting hours, expanded absentee. This was the highest turnout, in recent history, 55%. But to give you a perspective, McAuliffe met all of his metrics. The last election was an extraordinary Democratic turnout driven by anger in the 2017 election. McAuliffe got 200,000 more votes this time than the incumbent Democrat Ralph Northam got 4 years ago, but Youngkin got 500,000 more votes than Gillespie. So everybody showed up. And the old argument that when everybody shows up, Democrats win didn't work this time. And the main reason for that is that independents went Republican by a significant margin. And then finally, I mean, the national trends, as you can't look at Virginia in a vacuum. Republicans made gains in the Philadelphia suburbs. They won a state Supreme Court case and an election in Pennsylvania. They swept Long Island. They won a House seat in a heavy Democratic part of Texas. I mean, across the board. But on balance, this was a race about a 12-point swing from what we have seen normally. It wasn't just Virginia; it was across the country. But the governor-elect's, I think, unique political qualities is what made a difference down the stretch here. Finally, there was no ticket splitting. As you take a look at the race here, you could have separated with a nail file. The governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general. Voters didn't split their tickets, and as the governor-elect won the race, he brought in 7 new Republican House seats with him. So Republicans now have the state House. Two Democratic losses are pending recounts at this point. So there's a possibility they could be reversed. I think it's relatively remote, but it's possible. And you have a Democratic state Senate that is 21-19. We'll talk a little bit more about that.
So, one of the things I will point out at the time, Mark Herring almost did a point better than his colleagues running for governor and lieutenant governor. So a little bit of point splitting that we can probably attribute to this being General Herring's third statewide race. And in particular, he beat some of the expectations or the rest of the ticket in Loudoun and some of the places throughout southeastern Virginia. one of the things that, as we look at this first slide here that has the general election and partisan map, blue and red, that stuck out to me, Tom, was flips for Republicans in Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, and Chesterfield in particular. Dems had won those by slight margins, but still fairly consistent over the last few cycles. Do you attribute that to anything in particular besides a general Republican surge, or were there particular issues that you think affected Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, and Chesterfield, perhaps on a greater level?
Yeah, not all suburbs are the same. And in the Northern Virginia suburbs, although Youngkin did better than Gillespie, his improvements there, particularly in Arlington, Fairfax, not as much as they were in the outer suburbs. And Virginia Beach operates more as an outer suburb, kind of anti-urban area, and a strong military population down in Chesapeake and Virginia Beach. Republicans did not pick up any of the House seats they targeted in Northern Virginia. They picked up one in Fredericksburg. That's kind of the exurbs. But the other seats they picked up were in, like you say, Virginia Beach and the Tidewater area, and a couple rural seats where the rural white Republican conservative turnout just exceeded all expectations. So I think there is some differentiation in these areas where you had heavy minority voters. They showed up, but the rural white turnout showed up far greater than anybody had expected, and that led to a couple of surprising wins on election night for the Republicans that gave them the state house.
I'm sure it also didn't hurt the governor-elect to have grown up in Hampton Roads, or for General-elect Miyares to call that his home base as well.
No, that is correct. And look, the Republicans also had a diverse ticket, and we don't know what that means to have a white gubernatorial candidate, an African-American lieutenant governor candidate, and a Hispanic attorney general. But there's some feeling it might have taken the edge off to some ethnic voters that were concerned about the direction of the Republican Party. So you had all those factors in play. Look, just looking at the map very quickly, it doesn't look a lot different than the Trump-Biden map. Democrats run up their margin in urban areas and inner suburban areas and college towns and majority minority counties. The irony here is that in some of these rural areas, as I said, the vote, I think, beat all expectations, where Youngkin actually ran better than Donald Trump, and Trump was running up 85% in some of these counties. Youngkin exceeded that.
So, Tom, as you alluded to, in going to our next slide, it wasn't just a Republican sweep of the statewides, but also it was a net pickup of, tentatively right now, 7 seats in the House, which is going to mean a leadership change, and going from Speaker Fillercorn and Majority Leader Charnel Herring to a Speaker designate Todd Gilbert and Majority Leader designate Terry Kilgore. Obviously they're going to have a bit different take on what the priorities of the House should be going forward. How do you see those meshing with an incoming Youngkin administration?
Well, 2 things. First of all, usually state House seats are for 2 years. I think there's a strong possibility this is a 1-year term, and they're going to have to run this again next November in an even numbered year. This happened in the 1980s. There's a pending lawsuit now in the Fourth Circuit that if I were guessing, it looks like they may have to run this whole thing over again in new districts. Steve, you want to talk about that? These districts all change with the next election because of the census. You want to talk about that for a minute, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what we can expect out of the State House.
Sure, and I know we're circling back to that. The bipartisan redistricting commission was unable to come up with maps, so it went to the Virginia Supreme Court. They've just appointed their map drawers just the end of last week, and given them, I believe, 30 days to come back to the court and agree on certain maps. So we should be knowing, before Christmas, really what this is going to look like, both at the Virginia General Assembly and for our congressional redistricting. So it's going to be interesting to see how that turns out. One thing of note is that the Virginia Supreme Court struck of a few of the proposed map drawers as being too partisan. And so they've really kind of leaned into that this needs to be a nonpartisan process, at least as much as possible. But with that in mind, I'm going to be a little surprised if we see a seismic shift in the lines from where they are. I think it's going to be mostly on the margins. I don't personally expect big changes.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I mean, the court, I think, although if you had to break it down, the state Supreme Court, majority of the members are Republican, but I think they've tried to take that out of this. Look, this is the first time Virginia's gone through a commission process. The commission broke down. And ironically, the court asked the two map drawers, the Republican and Democrat, to try to agree on a map to make it easy for them, if that's possible. It's hard to get Republicans and Democrats to agree to anything. I think that's one of the reasons that the commission blew up. So it's going to be interesting to watch. But obviously, some of these districts change because the populations have moved toward the urban areas, which in a vacuum would tend to favor Democrats. But depending how you draw the maps, it could go the other way, as we've seen in some of these states like Texas and North Carolina.
Yeah, in that vein, I want to look at our next slide because it was showing the increased Republican shift by congressional district, which will obviously be impacted by the maps that are currently being drawn. We had one question that came in, and I want to encourage folks, if you have questions while we're talking, I'm monitoring those in real time. The question came in and said, can you extrapolate the numbers to the Tidewater laureate seat? How Young can do specific to the congressional district? And so you can see here on this slide that he did plus 12 better increase in the second congressional district, which if a Republican does 12 points better, as a generic Republican, 12 points better in a congressional race than they did in 20 would be a flip.
Yeah, both the second and the seventh would flip if the Youngkin numbers were to hold. Of course, that's a completely different election. And look, what we see across the country, our governor's races have a little bit a different rhythm to them than congressional races. Congressional races tend to be more parliamentary in their race, where people are voting the party, not the person. But you do have Republican governors in places like Maryland and Massachusetts and Vermont, and Democratic governors in places like Louisiana and Kansas that perform overwhelmingly for one party at the presidential level, but have been able to break. So I don't want to read too much into this. Although if I were a lawyer or Spanberger, I'd be nervous looking at these, but it's not necessarily indicative of what's going to happen a year from now.
Indeed, a year's an eternity in political time periods, and particularly, it remains to be seen how Democratic majorities in Congress can continue to put forward and actually get some things done, and whether or not that changes some of the dynamics on having things to run for in a midterm.
And Steve, I used to always tell my members when I was House Republican campaign chairman, things can always get better and they can always get worse. So you have no idea, what the political atmospherics will be a year from now. But I think this is a template that this just wasn't confined to Virginia. We saw this, as I said, in New Jersey and Long Island and Pennsylvania and Texas. Columbia, South Carolina just elected a Republican mayor, an overwhelmingly Democratic city. With President Trump gone from the White House at this point, he does not become the focal point of the midterms. It will turn more to Biden and how, as you said, the Democrats are doing at this point. And midterm elections tend not to be choice elections, but referendum elections. So as you know, a lot's going to happen on A, what the Democrats are able to accomplish, but B, how does this affect people on the ground?
I think that's right, which takes us nicely into our next slide when we start talking about what were those issues that voters said they cared about the most, right? And then you already touched on this first point about the big break for independence to Youngkin. I saw another headline that said many of those had broken in the last week, 2 weeks of the election, which I think is indicative of some of that public polling that folks saw leading up to showing it 1 point this way, 1 point that way. It really closed in at the end. And those top three issues, jobs, the economy, and education, it's interesting. Virginia ranked #1 state for business, coming in with a big surplus. You'd think that those would be helpful to the Democratic incumbent, but obviously not for those independents where it broke. Tom, you've worn a lot of hats, and you've also been very active on education issues in the Commonwealth. How do you think this education issue was able to break, and how do you think that's going to impact the administration?
I got to be careful what I say because I'm in that transition for this, but let me just say, as an overall on education, people were frustrated. Their kids had been in front of TV screens for a year. They were already upset. There we had masks that, played different in different areas, but you had a lot of parents right now that were not happy with their kids, in some cases, losing a year of education, despite maybe the public schools' best efforts to try to meet that. And then you add on to this some of these other issues, the Loudoun County issues with the transgender kid and the conviction out there, the the race theory issue to this, all of this kind of combined into an anger that made that issue ripe. And then in that debate, and I was there, where Terry McAuliffe talked about parents not being involved, and this was an issue for schools, that just kind of said it all in one sentence. It wasn't necessarily critical race. It wasn't transgender. It wasn't COVID. It was everything together for parents who were frustrated over this last year. It came to a head. And as you can see, the governor-elect pounded this issue in the last a couple of weeks. And the experience is, if you're an incumbent and you're under 50% going into election day, those undecideds will often break against you. And that's exactly what happened. Although Terry wasn't an incumbent, his party was an incumbent. He's a former governor. So for all intents and purposes, the independents said, no, we just want to change. And I think that education issue was critical in the closing weeks of the campaign.
Apropos, and we've talked about, and we'll talk about this in greater detail, but when we look at the midterms coming up, President Biden at 38% approval rating, I think, obviously the hope, but I would be surprised if he's that low a year from now. Who can tell, right? But
I think it can always get better and it can always get worse. What's not in this is when you look at the very favorable and the very unfavorable, it's even more pronounced. The president has, among conservatives in particular, in that base, a very unfavorable, and that drives that midterm turnout, where traditionally the out party is more energized than the in party because they tend to be angrier, and independents tend to take these midterm elections to put a check on the president rather than giving him a blank check. And I think that is what we saw in Virginia, and that is traditionally what's happened.
Now, Tom, gut reaction, if for some reason they have the entire the entire House has to be up again next year, along with the congressional seats, do you think that's net positive or net negative for Republicans?
Well, like you said, it depends on do things get better or if they get worse. So I think it's up in the air. I think Republicans feel a little more confident about that than Democrats, but you're running with some pretty strong Democratic incumbents for Congress on the ticket. And with this lack of ticket splitting, that could be an issue.
I mean, I think it's interesting that to your point, when you talk about, the out of power party is a little more energized. I'm wondering, if Democrats being out of power in the House, if that energizes state House candidates the same way you're theorizing it would energize Republican congressional candidates.
Yeah, I think it's going to be so nationalized, the midterm elections, that the state kind of takes a background, be my guess. But, a year's a long time, and we'll see. And look, Republicans can always overread their mandate. You get into the book burning business and those kind of things. Voters who might have voted for you this time because they were upset with schools, maybe gives them a hesitacy to come back. So I think parties always have to be careful in reading their mandates correctly. Spanbarger made that comment about, we elected Biden to be normal, not to be FDR. And sometimes you kind of take that mandate and you can overread. Republicans will need to understand that if they're elected in the midterm, it's to balance government. It's not necessarily an endorsement of their programs, and that's been traditional. I think we have a slide on that as we move up.
I think so. Let's go to the next slide if we could. And here's one of the interesting things, Tom, when we scheduled, this webinar, it was my hope that we'd be able to talk a little bit about the governor-elect's announcement of maybe who a few of the key members of his cabinet were going to be. Mm-hmm. And so I know you can't comment because of your help with the transition, but I think it's curious that he's taking as long as he has to name any members of the cabinet. So what we have here is just a reminder for our viewers of what the outgoing team looks like and how Virginia government is currently arranged. Traditionally, there can be one or two holdovers, either at the agency level or at the cabinet secretary level. For those who don't do work with Virginia government regularly, it's a little different than its federal counterparts. the secretaries are themselves sitting as agency heads. They sit usually as more kind of a chair of the board of agencies that report up to them. They house themselves in the Patrick Henry building, really on different floors in the same building as the governor, to really be there as part of that policy process. But when we look at some of the areas and issues that the governor-elect talked about on the campaign trail, he's talking about tax, he's talking about jobs. So that's fitting into Secretariats of Commerce and Trade and Finance. He talked a bit about education. Obviously, that falls in education. And it'll be interesting to see where some of these other key cabinet level personnel decisions are made. Chief of Staff is going to be key. Secretary of Transportation is going to be incredibly important. There's one of the largest project in the Commonwealth's history going on right now as it pertains to the expansion of the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. And there's always going to be more and more of those kind of capital projects moving forward. And so here we see what is the current composition of Governor Northam's cabinet. I'll be surprised if there's any holdovers, although there usually is, even from Republican and Democrat administrations. I want to say Governor McAuliffe kept the Secretary of Health. I want to say it was Bill Hazel at the time. Mm-hmm. Northam kept Secretary Moran, and he kept Aubrey Lane, who switched over from Transportation to Finance. Secretary Tomlinson had also made the transition from Governor McAuliffe to Governor Northam. So it'll be interesting to see if the governor-elect chooses to keep anybody else on and what decisions they make. And hopefully we'll get some insight into that in the coming weeks.
I think we will, but Steve, more importantly, he put Aubrey Lane right there in the middle of the transition, who served in 2 Democratic administrations in different cabinet posts, and he's probably forgotten more about state government than most of us will ever know. So if you take a look at that background in terms of his business background and the like, I think they want to get out and just really get some qualified people in there and not worry about some of the other things that the governors have chosen on. But we'll wait and see. I think we'll see in fairly short order some of these other things being named.
Right. I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of Secretary Lane. I had the privilege of working with him in both his capacity as Secretary of Transportation and Secretary of Finance. He is someone who is a results-focused leader, and I think that speaks volumes both to how the Youngkin administration will look at the finances of the Commonwealth, and also how they'll hopefully continue to support those capital projects, some of which had started when Secretary Lane was Secretary of Transportation.
And some of that's federal money that's passed through. Let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, so Tom, one of the things, many of the folks on the Democratic side through the election were frustrated with a little bit with the governor-elect is that the lack of specific policy proposals included on the governor-elect's or the then candidate's website. But here are kind of 2 in particular areas that were always on his website, that were always part of his thinking, focusing on education, the economy. So why don't you walk our viewers a little bit through these 2 day one game plans?
Yeah, I mean, the day one game plans are you initiate these. Some of them are going to, of course, take the support of the legislature, and in some cases of some of these new charter schools, it may take some localities buying into it. But these are the governor-elect's priorities. He campaigned on these things, keeping schools open 5 days a week. I think that spoke to the frustration parents had of having their kids on screens last year. Higher expectations at college. He hammered on the fact that we had a record number of people failing the SOLs last year, and that many kids had basically lost a year of education and trying to restore that. Basically some of the political agendas that he felt had cropped into the education system, trying to level the playing field on that and getting back to basics. So I think the education secretary will be critical, and more important, naming the superintendent of public instruction, which will handle the K through 12 areas. These were critical to his election campaign, and I think that's going to be critical to what he views as the success of his administration from his public comments.
To the extent that you can comment, how much do you think of that is going to be budget focused, and how much of that is going to be policy or instructional focused?
Well, I think it's both, and I think they go together. without getting into it. Sometimes money can change policy, if you know what I mean. In Congress, we could always get a little bit more if you give somebody an earmark, it made them a little more likely to vote for something. When you talk about setting up these charter schools, what level of state aid will be involved to encourage localities that might not have wanted them from one reason or another. I mean, the big losers here, it looks to me like, are the teachers unions. I think the Randy Weigarten was with Terry McAuliffe on election. They put over $3 million into his campaign, and they have a certain agenda. And so at this point, I don't know that that will be leading the charge in terms of where things go from here. On the economy, clearly the state has one of the largest surpluses it's had, and eliminating the grocery tax and suspending the recent gas tax hike for 12 months. He campaigned on it. You'll have to go to the legislature, but these are very popular items at this point. The tax rebate for joint filers, the governor-elect campaigned on giving some of that money back to taxpayers at this time, letting them spend the money the way they want to spend it instead of having the government spend it on their behalf. They did looked at property taxes running away. That's generally a local issue, but it also the state has gotten into these issues before, and we'll see how what they intend to do on that. But giving some of that surplus back and cutting taxes, I think, is something he campaigned on. It was a differentiator in this race, and I think we can continue to look at that.
As we look at this, the output from the federal infrastructure bill, this isn't a particular area that the governor-elect campaigned on, but I think that nonetheless, it's going to be an important part of his first 2 years really in office. We have there in that sub bullet, we talk about 1.5 billion going to new projects, breaking down into thirds about how it be designated into use. But Virginia has been really at the forefront of the country on these sort of infrastructure projects, be that the expanding of the high occupancy transit lanes around 495, 95, figuring out what to do in 81, expanding lanes on 64, new rail opportunities, both commuter rail and interstate and freight, how those things impact with the Virginia Port Authority and how that impacts supply channels. I think it's always going to be a going area of concern and opportunity in Virginia. And I think that's an area that, particularly with $1.5 billion coming from the feds for new Virginia projects, that's going to be an area, ripe for bipartisan solution and cooperation as they go into this session.
Yeah, it's going to be nice to have federal money to spend, because for 15 years we haven't had that transportation authorization. They haven't been able to pass one, and so he will be able to set the priorities in terms of where this goes.
It'll be exciting for certain. As we go to the next slide, we touched on a bit of this. What's next? Midterm elections and redistricting. Tom, as we kind of peel it back a little bit, talking about redistricting, how much hedging, posturing during this session do you think they're going to have to go through once they know what lines look like or don't, and how that impacts of the political calculus going into November 2022?
Well, remember, you have divided government. And so no party's going to be able to ram anything through. We're one of only 2 states, by the way, that have a divided legislature, Minnesota and Virginia. And the only reason we have it is because we stagger the elections between the state Senate and the state House. You do have a couple independent Democrats in the state Senate that you can win over on certain issues. And I'll talk about some of the issues I think will be coming before that, where there are opportunities to move some things. But once they see what their lines look like, in the closing days of legislatures, these things become very political. People start taking a look and voting their next election. So it's going to be interesting. Traditionally, you have a 2-year term and you get things done your first year, and the second year is your political messaging. This time, you may, assuming the court case comes out the way we think it will, you're into politics right away. Note that General Assembly members cannot take money during the time that they are in session. On the budget, even though you have a divided Senate and House, I think the governor-elect has made it clear we're not going to have any shutdowns. They're going to try to reach agreements. I think they'll be successful with that. and redistricting out of the hands of the legislature now. The focus is really going to be on the state Supreme Court, but this should be resolved pretty quickly, and by in the middle of the legislative session, if not before.
Yeah, and again, I'll reiterate the point I made earlier, which is that I'm going to be surprised if the General Assembly seats change dramatically. I think just because of population shift, the congressional seats will have to move some, and I think to a little bit greater extent than the state house or the state senate. I just think there's too much of a population growth in Northern Virginia as opposed to Southwest. Those lines have to move in some way, shape, or form. But I think it's going to be a little bit more pronounced on the congressional side.
Steve, let me just note, I always say Virginia is not a one-party state. It's two one-party states when you take a look at the line. So, I mean, Youngkin is wanting 80%, 75, 80% in a lot of the western part, and he's losing that in some of the cities. That the number of legislative districts that are actually competitive are relatively few in the mix. We'll see what the court does with that when it comes out. But most of these members, the only race they worry about is their primary anyway. And primary voters, as you know, don't reward compromise. They think they're right and the other side's wrong. And that's what's made compromise so difficult in this. With new districts coming up, though, and people having to feel their way through it, may change that dynamic a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I push back a little bit because I think there was 10 seats that were decided by under 2 points, which is,
Right.
not 10% of the House. It isn't an insignificant number of seats that come down to, a few votes this way or that.
Right, I agree with that. But the party caucuses are dominated by your one-party groups. And look, you may have some members that have been in really red or blue districts that, because of redistricting, all of a sudden have some new members, and that may temper where they come down. But we'll be a lot smarter on this in a month.
Absolutely. We should know by Christmas. Now, you mentioned this. Let's go to our next slide, if we could. Why the president's party loses House seats in midterms.
Yeah, and look, there are four major factors. In 36 of 39 since the Civil War, the president's party has lost. I might add 2002, one of those exceptions. I was campaign chairman. I can walk you through what was different. But look, the fact is, when presidents win, and this is true with governors, when governors win, they bring people in on their coattails. When members have to survive on their own, sometimes those coattails aren't there, and they tend to lose. Secondly, the president's party, or the governor's party in this case, becomes a little more complacent. They're in power, and the out party is more energized and angrier. So the intensity goes to the out party. And finally, as I said, independent voters like to balance government. They put a check on the president rather than giving them a blank check. In midterm elections, when you go back, have been referendums on the incumbent president. They have not been choice elections. There have been attempts where we tried to make them choice elections. And I just finally add that under one-party governments, which we have nationally today, I'm just going to talk national, not state, for a second. The last 4 times you've had one party control the House, the Senate, and the presidency, they've lost the House, and by exaggerated margins, more than I think was anticipated, because there's only one group to blame. In 2002, one of the exceptions, we had a tie. We had a Senate that was 51-49 Democratic, and that broke up the one-party government. And I will tell you, as campaign chairman, had we had a Republican Senate, the midterms would have been different. But when you have somebody else to blame and you have different narratives, it takes the sting off of angry voters. When there's only one party in power, they get punished for all kinds of things, many of which they have nothing to do with.
That was the Jim Jeffords switch cycle,
right. When Jeffords switched, the Republican leadership in the House, everybody was distraught except me. And I'm smiling because I knew this broke up. The one-party government was going to make the midterm at least better for me as the campaign chairman.
Yeah, Tom, you're always smiling. So let's look at our next slide, the more important thing, which is that, when we look at, governing, what that means when the rubber hits the road, coming into this legislative session, the first few months of a Youngkin administration, and that first bullet, divided government means bipartisan solutions, and you hit on it. We're talking about small margins, 52-48 in the House, 21-19 Democratic control in the Senate. Tom, let's hit on some areas. I want to hit this from both areas that you think are where there's potential for compromise, and areas that we think are, third rail, do not go.
Yeah, I don't want to comment too much on education because we're in the
Sure.
middle of that at this point, except to say I think there is room here for everybody to find some win-wins along the way of accommodating the governor-elect and his desire to set up more charter schools around the state. There are a number of ways that you can do that, but you only need a couple Democrats in the Senate to switch on that. Secondly, I mean, you've known Dick Saslaw. I know Dick Saslaw, the Democratic leader in the Senate. He's a deal maker. And he's somebody that we found out traditionally you can work with on these things. I think on some of the budget issues, they will come together. There will be, of course, different priorities, but I see those opportunities to come together. COVID, I think we know where the governor stands on COVID in terms of statewide mandates, but he's made it clear that he's not going to interfere with some of the localities and not going to pick that fight. On labor, right to work, those kind of things, at least you won't get any further change in those laws. There are, as you know, collective bargaining laws now on the books that are being enacted by some of these jurisdictions, but with divided government, I think that's probably not going to change over the short term. Municipal elections is one thing that I see a possibility to change, and that's simply because right now the Democratic legislature moved elections for city and town elections to November, ostensibly to save money. Traditionally, many of these have been in May. The cities and towns, many of them didn't like that when you take a look at the organizations that represent them. Democrats like it because in most of these cities and towns tend to be more Democratic in their orientation, particularly in the eastern end of the state. And they can elect council members, not on local issues, but just on the Democratic sample ballot. Republicans didn't like this, but you have a couple Democrats in the state Senate oppose that change. And so there is an opportunity to move some of those elections back to May. This is kind of in the weeds, I think, for many of our listeners, but I think something that you need to look at. And then election laws, Republicans and Democrats have completely different philosophies. Democrats are always crying voter suppression and Republicans are always crying voter fraud. And they just look at the world differently. But with divided government, I think you're going to just see a stalemate at this point along these lines and likely more rhetorical than substantive.
I agree with that. I don't see any changes getting through the Senate on voting rights issues that would further be restrictive. To the extent that you have to go through the Senate Judiciary, I think John Edwards, the Democratic senator out of Roanoke who chairs that, has been pretty clear on his views on the sort of restrictive changes. I don't think they would even get to the floor.
Let me add one other thing. Let me just add one other thing, because this has happened with a couple of other governors, is when it's been this close. We saw this with Jim Gilmore in the state house. He appointed a couple Democrats into cabinet or sub-cabinet positions. Legislators only get $18,000 a year in Virginia. That hasn't changed forever. And there are people who've been there for a long time that if they were to move into an administration position for $150,000 a year, their high 3 years would factor better into their retirement. And traditionally, there's been an effort to try to get some of these people to get into the administration and where you can pick up their seats. Now, there aren't that many seats that are competitive in the state Senate. But the irony is that under the law, the special election for the state Senate would likely be in the new state Senate district that's drawn. And so that gives an opportunity in at least 3 seats for them to try to engage a Democrat and have them come into the administration with the possibility of picking up that election and picking up control. I only say that not because of any inside information, but because this has been done before, and it's a natural political move when it's this close.
It has, and like I always appreciate the palace intrigue that comes in, because this is a conversation that seems to happen with every new administration, be that Democrat or Republican, is that who can they pick off? I think that's tough on Senate seats right now, because I only think there is maybe
2 or 3.
one, maybe 2 that a Republican would be competitive in, and I don't see Senator Edwards leaving his seat in Roanoke to do that.
We'll just have to, and we don't know what the new districts would look like. So it would be based on not the current district, but on whatever the new district is. But I just throw that out as kind of outside the box in terms of the palace intrigue that goes on.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting, this next bullet, we have continuity of government and agency engagement. So for those who have lived through transitions before, one of the common uses from incoming governors is to give many agency heads what they call like a 100-day letter, which is to say, we may or may not reappoint you, but we're going to keep you through 100 days. Because it is so incredibly challenging to come in as an agency head and get up to speed immediately, particularly when you start off in the middle of session. And so a lot of times before they make permanent changes, they keep the existing agency head to get them through those first 90 days in office through the legislative session. And this is incredibly important when you think about engaging with these departments and agencies, particularly the ones that have a outward facing component like the Department of General Services. When you talk about VITA, the Virginia Information Technologies Agency, when you talk about DHRM, when you talk about VDOT, these are areas where I would be surprised. Of course, it's the governor-elect's purview, but to get through session and not keep some of these folks, at least for those first couple months. So I would anticipate, as far as early engagement goes, that you're going to be dealing with Commissioner Britch, you're going to be dealing with Joe D'Amico, you're going to be dealing with all of those, with Nelson Moe at VITA, you're going to be dealing with some of these folks into or past the legislative session. Most of them have had long histories in state government and were brought in not as Democrats or Republicans, but for subject matter expertise.
Yeah, even on these policy making boards, you know, when you talk about your highway commissions, when you talk about the education, you talk about the state corporation commission, these issues, the governor doesn't come in and clean house. They serve for terms, and you have to wait for those terms to expire. So it generally takes the governor probably a couple of years to even change some of those policy making boards.
And, you know, Rick Holcomb's been there at DMV, I want to say through the last 4 governors. Yeah. So those kind of positions can, you know, have some permanence, even from administration to administration, to maintain that continuity of government in areas that shouldn't have a partisan lean. Tom, I got a political question that came in, which talked about, you know, Virginia Democrats debating whether or not to spend resources in Southwest Virginia and more populated areas to engage with independent voters. And do you have an opinion on that? I'm gonna give you my opinion first, and then I'll let you chime in, even though our dear viewer wants the congressman's opinion. I think Democrats need to compete for every voter, and you can't think that you've hit, you know, the floor in any particular jurisdiction. I think we need to make sure that we are appropriately investing in voter engagement and persuasion. And I think that includes Southwest. And I think a lot of the things that the Democratic Party has stood its candidacy on would hit home there, whether that's issues of healthcare, whether that's job training, whether that's bring business to those regions. I think those are important messages that can resonate with folks there. And as we saw from this election, you don't need necessarily as a Democrat to win those jurisdictions, but you do need to improve. And so you shouldn't count that you've hit the floor without engaging those folks. And so even, you know, if you got 5% this last cycle, even if you move that to 6 or 7 across, you know, what is now the 9th congressional district, if you did a point better in each of those localities, that would have been enough for Democratic success statewide. But
yeah, look, I do think McAuliffe went down to these areas. He'd spent some time in these areas, but he never really courted these areas. The environmental issues, for example, you found Mark Warner would spend some time talking about coal and the future of coal. McAuliffe's decided there are just more environmentalists in Northern Virginia than there are coal miners. And he went kind of the full Monty the other way. And so the Youngkin campaign just was able to play McAuliffe's ads back on guns and on abortion and on the environment. That just, I think, played very, very well. The question for the Democrats are, what are they going to be able to offer, and what's the amount of their resources? In modern campaigns, we've seen people play more to their base than they are to swing voters at this point. And so Southwest Virginia is tough. It's nice to show the flag at this point, but they're saddled with a national administration that, although on economic issues, for example, bringing broadband to rural America and the like, offer some things, they're getting shut out because of their environmental issues and the cultural issues, which right now take preference in terms of people voting. I'd add the other way around for suburban voters, where Republican economic policies may, you could argue, offer them more. People are still concerned more with the cultural issues and are voting that. But look, I think it's important to take a stab once in a while in these areas, but these areas are losing population, and they're not going to beat Morgan Griffith down there in the 9th District or pick up any legislative seats at this point. I think they're going to have to concentrate on the outer suburbs, and I think that's where the fight is going to be. Places like Virginia Beach, Stafford, Loudoun County, Prince William, this is really where the battle is going to be fought over the next couple of cycles.
Another question came in: predictions or insight on transportation or DMV issues for the next 4 years. I think that's still going to be a driving force in Virginia. I think it's going to be a multimodal areas. I think you're looking at investment in rail and freight. And I think one of the things that you've seen as a priority, or at least a recognition over the last 8 to 12 years, is how all these areas intersect. And that is investing in the Virginia Port Authority, making sure that we are getting freight rail to be part of that supply chain, recognizing the multimodal ways that folks are commuting in and out of work. And that means expanding high occupancy transit lanes. That's meant improvements to Metro. And I think that folks have seen that even on the western side of the state, and trying to figure out solutions on the I-81 corridor. And so I think that these are areas of continuing prominence. And Tom, I think and I've mentioned this, I guess it's the third time, but a bipartisan area. Because transportation infrastructure, everyone needs to get to work, and everyone knows that if you want to, start businesses or do big changes in headquarters, one of the biggest things is being able to have your workforce get to and from work. As Northern Virginia gets more and more consolidated and transportation becomes that much bigger of an issue, and you're starting to see that more and more in southeastern Virginia, from Richmond all the way down through Hampton Roads.
Yeah, and transportation was really not front and center of this campaign. You didn't hear the candidates talk much about it because we've been in this pandemic where the traffic flow, use of Metro and the like has really not been the issue that it will be once we return to normal. At that point, things change markedly. So there'll be as you noted, Steve, there'll be a flush of new money coming into the state from the federal government, and the state is going to make that decision over how that is spent. That gives the new governor a lot of leverage in terms of what he's able to do, the priorities he sets, and helping him maybe move his legislative agenda in other ways. But having more money is a good thing.
Absolutely. Feel free for folks who have additional questions, either put it in the Q&A or the chat. We're here we have a few minutes left and can answer anything that comes up. Tom, to the extent that you can opine, and I think you've alluded to, when do you think we can expect to hear some announcements out of the Youngkin transition as to some staff announcements?
I think he's on his own schedule. People who know the governor-elect, he's been extremely successful in business. He was in the top 5% of his class at Harvard Business School. He's going to be very analytical about this. So I don't think he's on the press's schedule or anybody else. I think it's a question of just finding the right people, casting a wide net, as he's done, to Republicans and Democrats and people from across the state, trying to get the best ideas. So I would not care to speculate on when we're going to see this. And I don't know that there's any particular pressure on him to do this on anybody's schedule, but his own in getting the right people.
I'm going to go ahead and speculate and say that within 10 days after Thanksgiving, we'll have at least one or two.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me, but I don't know what their schedule is as they start moving this up inside at this point. As you know, he hasn't named a chief of staff yet, which is usually named much earlier. All I can tell you is he's got a lot of people and listening to a lot of ideas as they formulate this. And anybody that knows the governor-elect knows he is thoughtful and deliberate. And I can tell you, working on the campaign with him, presenting him with things that he's always looking for, what's the other side of this? How do we look at this? So we'll see.
Absolutely. It's going to be interesting. I think one of the things that we've both hit on, but is a good takeaway for today, which is that, for the first time in a long time, Virginia has a divided government, which means for those looking to engage in that legislative or executive administrative function, it's going to mean making sure that you're engaging productively on both sides of the aisle, both with leadership on both sides, when Dems had full control, I think that, that meant engaging with the Democrats almost exclusively. Same thing with Republicans. But now that it's, we're back in a divided government, it's going to be making sure that engaging on all those levels.
Steve, let me comment on that. I think that's right. So if you have issues between state government, obviously you're going to want to get in and see the new administration, as quickly as you can and see where they are going. But I think it's important that you check with your allies in the legislature on both sides of the ledger, because bills are going to need to get passed out of both houses on this. Also, legislators can be influential sometimes on what happens in the executive branch in both sides. But for the first time, there's a smile on some of the Republican lobbyists in Richmond now. They've been kind of shut out over the last couple of years. Things have a way of turning around. We're going to be a lot smarter in a month when we see what these new lines look like, because most of these elections are won in terms of how you draw the district and who files. And it's going to be this will be a very, very rapid process. And the legislature, Republicans will be full of ourselves in terms of, well, now we have control, but you got to temper that thing. You got to go right back into election. By the way, can we get this thing through the Senate? How effective do we want to be? Or we want to hold our powder and try to take the Senate and then be able to act in a unitary manner? What we see across the country are voters just not splitting their tickets. You noted that the Attorney General ran first among Democrats, but even with Youngkin's narrow margin, it wasn't enough. People were voting for governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and the state delegate. My precinct on the election day turnout voted straight Republican, and you could have separated with a nail file the governor from the state delegate candidate who spent no money and was running against a 40-year incumbent. People are just coming out there. As I said, these are parliamentary voting patterns, and even though it's a balance of power structure, and we're still struggling with how to make that work.
Excellent. Well, Tom, I'm not seeing any more questions in our chat, so I think we've reached that end. But obviously, if folks have questions,
let me give them my email if you have one, and you can give them. Mine is simply tom.davis@hklaw.com. If you have any questions, email me. Be happy to try to get back to you.
And I'm Stephen.Cobb@hklaw.com. And so don't hesitate to reach out with questions or comments. And we appreciate everyone taking part of the middle of their day on a holiday week to come in and listen to us chat a little bit about Virginia politics. And Tom, as always, it's always a great pleasure to get in and talk politics with you. And thank you for the time. And we look forward to chatting with folks. Tom, I will note that one person asked about whether or not Jean Marie has any ambitions to serve. And so I'm not going to put you on the spot to ask, but you can let her know that someone.
Her husband, she has to go through her husband for that. So don't worry about it.
Well, you can let her know that, right now. you can let her know that someone was inquiring.
I'll do that. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.